Start recording. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are in the middle of trying to figure out how our entities get sort of handled as groups when necessary. And yeah, we sort of started on that a little bit yesterday, but I thought about it after having started down a certain path yesterday, and I was thinking I kind of thought of a different idea that I hadn't considered. And I wasn't sure exactly what I do and don't want to do in terms of trying stuff out there. So I wanted to briefly go over kind of what my thinking was and why I was thinking it with you, so that you'll know where I'm coming from, because I think I may reverse course slightly from what we did yesterday. Okay. So here's the essential problem that we have. That is that let's say that we have two entities, such as with our hero, where we've got kind of the the torso piece, or I guess right now we've been calling that the body, and then we've got the head. And these are actually separate entities, and in theory, during parts of the game, they may even detach if you have like some kind of magic spell or something. Who knows, right? So they're capable of acting separately, but they're also capable of acting together. And this is like a case that I want to start working on a little bit more to try and make sure that it's handled cleanly, because I think we're going to need this in more cases as well. And so one of the examples that I think is worth noting for this, right, is let's say we wanted a snake-like boss monster, or just not even boss monster, but just a monster. And maybe that thing kind of looks like a little like snaky sort of thing, where it's got sort of a head piece with like antenna or whatever, and then little body pieces here that it kind of has. Maybe, I don't know if they've got legs or what's going on, and it can occupy many squares, right? And when the head piece moves, the body pieces kind of move with it, right? And obviously, you'd want to make it so that if you attack and kill this piece, then it becomes sort of severed, but maybe like this part still walks around and this part does too. So it's like it breaks into two pieces and then keeps moving, right? And so, I feel like we're going to have multiple different places where this sort of thing comes in. Yet another example might be, let's suppose that I've got some enemy creature, like boss monster, kind of a thing that's like, some piece that's sitting across a couple squares or whatever. But then it also has, like little like arm things that come out to try and get you or whatever. And maybe those are, somehow attached. Or maybe it's got a little floating piece that goes around with it that like kind of circles it or whatever. And again, like, in a lot of these cases, you sort of end up in this situation where it's very similar to the way the entity system was sort of I was conceptualizing having that work, in terms of just having sort of this collection of properties and things without having to really define what it is, so that it can sort of amorphously shift between different sort of ways of being. The same is sort of true for these things. Like, if there's 2 or 3 arms to the guy and a body or whatever, then they should be controlled as such. If one of the arms gets detached and needs to go off and be a separate entity for some reason and isn't controlled by the main entity or something, that should be fine. You kind of want this flexibility to sort of mix and match these entities at will and not really have to worry about their controllers being something you create up front. You kind of want them to be able to sort of have these controllers be more dynamic than that, right? And that's kind of tricky. So what I was thinking is, rather than go down the route that we were going down yesterday, where we sort of have this notion that entities kind of know about who they're paired with, and it's this mutual direction kind of a thing, I'm concerned about that because I just don't feel like that is the natural way to write the code. And like, you saw me struggle with it a bit, and I mean, struggle is a weird word because I guess it wasn't like it wasn't working, but you saw me have to do a bunch of things to like figure out, well, where does the code for the head go? Where does the code for the body go, right? And you kind of just want to have a head-body controller that does both of them, right? And then if there's a separate controller that only does bodies, that's fine, or maybe it just has some if code. But spreading the code out to two different things is not so good, right? We'd rather have the code in one place, and then it just does, well, if there isn't a head, then just don't do the head part, maybe. But, you know, it's not like we want to write this code in isolation of knowing about both entities. And so forcing it into a concept that every entity simulates itself, it's like I'm falling into the trap that I would never have fallen into in regular code, right? I would always tell someone not to be an OOP programmer, right? I would say, why are you writing this code that's like focused on breaking up the code amongst objects when the natural place to write it is across the objects, right? And the same thing is true in the entity system. Like, why would we break up the controller for a head and a body when the more natural way to write that is a head-body controller that just checks to see whether the head is there or not, and then does one thing or another, right? And so what I'd rather do is step back from that sort of OOP-like stupidity and go into something that's, again, more focused on the algorithm, and how can we get the entity system to work in this way that works across objects? And so I thought of a way to actually do that, which is kind of interesting, and I hadn't really considered this before. And so I think this is what I'd rather try. And again, I don't have a lot of examples yet, so I'm just trying it. I'm trying to figure out what might work for this guy, and then we could maybe write another one for something like, you know, maybe that snake dude. And so I could make like a snake creature. And then we could see, like, does it hold up or doesn't it hold up? Because we have one use case, and we can figure out something that works for that, but then, you know, maybe writing another use case would be a good way to validate it and make sure that, oh, it's not just like something that only works for this one case, it works across more than that, right? So here's what I thought of. And it's a little weird, but I feel like it's interesting. So the way that we have things work now is, right, we've got this sort of sim region concept, right? And when we unpack things, we sort of have all these chunks in the world, and they get unpacked into the sim region, right? And then we have actual entities. And so during that unpacking process, we see all these entities come through, and we put them into the hash table so that we know what their IDs are, and we can look them up by ID if we happen to have an entity that wants to, like, you know, chase another entity. And so the idea of an entity reference in that case still makes a fair bit of sense to me, and I don't think it necessarily needs to get removed, because that still seems reasonable, meaning there's some entity reference things that still make sense, which are not things, you know, if it's not something I'm talking about controlling, if it's something that I'm actually talking about, I'm looking at this guy or I'm attacking this guy, that I think can stay the way we had it, where there's just this notion of an entity reference and an entity can reference another entity in that way. That seems fine. What doesn't seem fine was the thing about entities coming together to form a coherent operating unit. And so that's the part that I wanted to focus on fixing. So what I thought I would do is say, okay, what if in addition to the hash table, we also have a thing that's like controller templates? And I don't mean templates like the C++ kind that suck. I mean templates like, in a literal sense, like we have sort of like ideas of what a controller can be. And so one example of a controller template might be the hero controller that we've talked about, and that has a slot for the body and it has a slot for the head, right? Okay. Now, any entity in our system, when it's packed into the chunk, can have a thing in it, and they all, I guess, would probably have one of well, no, I guess only entities that have controllers active on them would have this, I suppose, would have what's called a controller tag on them, or something like this, some name of that type. And what that would have is the template type, and an instance ID, right? Now the instance IDs can come from the same place as our entity IDs come from, just a monotonic increasing thing. And the template type is what kind of controller it's currently expecting to have, right? Furthermore, we add one more thing in here, which is the slot. Now, these things, and I suspect this slot will be like a slot, just a slot. And so this is, you know, this could just be an index. We'll have to see how we want to store it. All right. The template types are all the different controllers that we might have. Just any controller that we might have. So the hero controller, the snake controller, the whatever, blah, 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 right? So all of our things get a controller, and they get an instance ID which says, what group is this actually associated with? So if I create a hero, each of the pieces of that hero would have a template type that was the hero controller, right? It's one of these. And it would have an instance ID that's just some instance ID that's picked that all of them share, right? When they get unpacked, we have a separate hash table for instance IDs. We look up in the instance ID to see if we already have a controller at that instance ID. And if we do, we insert this entity into its corresponding slot, body or head or whatever. Now, if this slot is an array type slot, then it can have multiple in there, right? You can stick a bunch of them in there. And if it doesn't, then it can only have one, right? And we'd have to decide how we deal with conflicts. And maybe the way we deal with it is you can always have more than one in there, and it's the controller's responsibility to do something smart if it's got multiple of them. Who knows, right? I'm not sure how exactly that would work. Okay. So this way, the way things work is at any time, we can just take any entity, right, and make it into its own thing by just assigning it a new template type, which is whatever controller we want it to have, and a new instance ID, right, and what slot it goes in there. We can group entities together by just giving them the same instance ID. So if some guy wants to like pick up something and stick it on and use it as his arm, we just take its template type and assign it to whatever his controller is. You take its instance ID and assign it to whatever his instance ID is, and we take its slot and assign it to arm. Now that thing just has a new arm, right? And they're all gathered together based on whenever the sim region is, gathers the things up. Anything that happens to be in that room is controlled by that thing. And this word would work in ridiculous scenarios. If I bash this guy's arm off, right, and now I'm carrying the arm for this creature around with me somehow, right? If I walk off the screen and carry it over and drop it somewhere, if that guy comes walking over and can get to his arm, right, he still knows when he walks into the region that that's his arm, and his controller will still see it in the arm slot and go, oh, that thing was part of me, right? So it can do all of the things that you would normally do if you created some kind of superstructure, but it's entirely on demand, so it can be broken and streamed apart and doesn't have any sort of cleanup or deletion associated with it. There's no maintenance. It's all stored each per entity and assembled at sim time, so there's no overhead, essentially, to doing it. And there's no restrictions on doing it. You don't have to keep these things live or worry about what happens if it thinks there's a head there and there isn't, or any of those things, because they're all always assembled each time you go to do a sim. I don't know. So maybe there's something I'm not thinking of, but it feels really right to me. And it gets rid of that object-oriented nastiness that's what makes things so ugly and bad in regular code. I don't want that inherited into our entity system in just another form. And so I think this gets us around that and allows us to write the code in a natural way. So I'm just going to go and do that and see what happens. Okay. So first things first, I don't know why I'm still in C-tray, because I'm in the wrong place. Well, it doesn't matter. I guess I can just, when I load, it'll fix it. So if I go to Handmade project, do a little buildy poo, then really, to be honest, probably what I do here is I just revert yesterday's changes, because I don't think I even want them. But we didn't change very much, so I probably won't bother going through that actual, I don't know what I'm trying to think of what I'm actually doing here. Oh yeah. I probably won't actually bother going through that. But really, what we did yesterday, we just don't need. Because we're never going to stream out array storage, at least not of references that I can think of. So we really just don't need to do that. It's simply not necessary. By the way, I don't know if Alan's watching. He was wondering how to encounter that bug. Let me see if I can do it again. This was a bug Alan was asking about, and I was just able to make it happen. So I've loaded the Handmade Hero project. Let me switch to a buffer, roll -up, and if I hit X, I'm locked up. So all I have to do is open a buffer, hit X, and the first time I do that, it looks like it locks up. Then as soon as I switch that buffer to something else, I'm back in gear. And it never happens again. So it must be something with the first time you create something in a panel like that. Yeah. And it has to do with, I think it's like, we were looking at My4Coder Custom. It does have something to do with My4Coder Custom because I think we had nerfed some things when we were working on it originally that weren't implemented yet in 4Coder or weren't working yet in 4Coder. So it may be just that. But that's how you reproduce the bug, if that helps. So load a buffer, hit X to spawn the new window. That window's locked, but as soon as you change buffers, it unlocks, and then it's never a problem again as far as I can tell. So it has to be like an empty panel, and you have to X, use the X command to move into it, I guess. Seems like it. And I don't know if that happens if I delete stuff down to an empty panel. I don't know how to get back to an empty panel. I don't know how to get back to an empty panel, so I'm not sure how to see if it ever happens outside of that. Yeah. Let's see. And it looks like, I guess, maybe it doesn't have to be empty. It looks like the compilation buffer was enough. But it's very clear that after I get out of that, it doesn't happen again. Like here I am hitting X all day long. And no big deal, right? So I have no idea. But it just must be something peculiar. All right, so anyway, sorry for that diversion. I just know that was a bug Alan wanted to fix, and so I wanted to make sure I got that repro in there. Like I said, it may just be something with My4Coder Custom, but that's now we know. All right, so anyway, inside sim region and entity, I have to repair a little bit of the damage I did, and simply say that now we're not probably going to store relationships anymore. We're just going to have the entity references the way that they used to be, right? Oops. Like so. And these relationships are not going to be there anymore, right? That's just not going to be a thing anymore. Let's see, entity reference is valid. That's going to be not having to check the relationship stuff. So I don't even know. Yeah, this doesn't really need to be there anymore. What is happening? There we go. This doesn't need to be there anymore. And this doesn't need to be there anymore either. There we go. So something like this. Okay. So what we would be replacing this with, again, is I kind of want this notion of the templated thing. This goes away. And so in here, I essentially want, a thing that's like entity controller type. And this is like controller, none. Controller hero. And, let's be optimistic and say we're going to have a snake controller as well, right? If that makes sense. Okay. So these controllers are the things that'll kind of assemble up the creatures. And so in here, I would have something that would say, okay, I've got the entity controller type. And that's the type of the controller template that I want to use, right? And this can just be set to none if it's just an entity that doesn't have that type of controller. And then it has like an entity controller slot. And I don't really know that I want that to be anything, like I said. We'll write the code for it, I don't really want to call it writing the usage code first, because I kind of just have this imaginary thing in my head. So we're just going to have to kind of play with it and see by writing a hero controller. But at the moment, until we actually have some more code that I can actually look at, I'm thinking this is just a thing that's like literally an index, right? So there's just, some number of slots on this controller. And you can pick which one you go in. So I can have the controller type, I can have a controller slot, and I can have a controller instance ID, right? And that can just be an entity ID. I don't know that we need it to be separate, and I'm not sure. But again, at the moment, I'm going to keep them separate, and this is just to make sure that I don't accidentally conflate them, right? And so so this would essentially be what would be necessary to assemble those sort of meta entities, right? You can kind of think of this as you know the entity kind of that's built out of this set of entity pieces, if you will. And you know, there's a couple things about it that I'm not quite sure about yet. Like whether it itself needs additional storage. And if it itself needs additional storage, there are some things we could do. And that's why, like I said, I don't know if this is a separate ID. Like if the superstructure also has data, then this would have to be one of these, where it's like this is my sort of meta entity that builds, you know, out of me, essentially. But I don't know if we need that or if we don't. And furthermore, I don't know if we want that or we don't. Like, I think we might want to make it more that the properties of the meta entity are determined by its sub-entities, because that's kind of what makes the organicness. Whereas if it just sort of has inherent properties, I don't know. Like, you know, I feel like you want the brain of the thing to be based on what it has on it. And so, like, if the thing gets its head chopped off, I don't want it to still necessarily know a bunch of settings that we magically set. It should become a stupid arm that has, like, that's just derived from whatever it's derived from. So I don't really know that part yet. So for the moment, I'm just going to say that these are separate, and you can't use like an entity controller ID anywhere else. Like, it's just literally for this one hashing operation, and it's a totally separate table from the entity ID table. That's just my thinking at the moment. So we'll see. And technically, since this is something we're playing with here, I feel like these should kind of go down here, right? And so this kind of replaces the notion of the entity type, because now the entity itself never has a type. It just has whatever's controlling it at this time, because that's the only thing that's actually unique, meaning only one thing is allowed to control me. It's either the player's controller or a thing or whatever. So rather than saying this is a hero, we're never going to say that again. We're just going to say it has a hero controller on it, but whatever it is defined by other things, right? And then if for some reason some part of it gets broken off, that part can just be picked up by another controller, and it just off it goes. And its type, it has nothing to do with that, right? It may be a glove. Its type is not glove, right? It just happens to be part of the hero controller in the glove slot. If it breaks off later, it can become a piece of something else. And, you know, that's kind of the way that I want it to work, right? So that's why I'm trying to get away from the notion that an entity itself has an intrinsic type, and more that that is a diffuse piece of information stored in many places. So instead of type determining who your controller is and how you're drawn and all this other thing, each one of those should be defined by other things. And so we want to break that entity type into multiple things that can be different, right? Again, so that's just kind of, I kind of explained that yesterday, but I'm just trying to continue to say why I'm pushing towards this rather than just having one universal type, because I'm trying to find where that other, I'm trying to get to this other place, right, that I feel like is there in my head, but that I don't really know, which is kind of the nature of architecture, right? Okay. So that's what I actually want to do. We now no longer really have any sort of me and it kind of a thing. Like, I don't have an actual entity reference anymore that actually needs to happen. But, you know, I should probably, you know, like I said, we do want entity reference. I'm not getting rid of entity reference. It's just not actually a thing anymore that is in any of the creatures we have. It will be, I think, target, like who I'm targeting when I'm attacking or stuff like that, will be an entity reference. So I think there will be entity references. It's just now the controller aggregation replaces pairing. So pointers back and forth to people, they're gone, right? Okay. So in here we have an entity hash, right, which is one of these guys. But we're also going to have a controller hash. And I don't know why I call it an entity controller, because it's not like we have other controllers. Oh, well, and you know what? Controller might be a weird word, because controller sounds like game controller. So maybe before I get too far, we could call it brain, maybe? Because that's like, you know, what's the brain type? It's not maybe the most descriptive, but it's going to be unique. You know what I mean? So let's try that. Let's just say we have like these sort of slots, and it's brain, right? Brain. So I'm going to go ahead and make each of those, make each of them's. And then in here, we'll have a brain hash, which sounds like some kind of a bad ad on like an after-school special or something. So this would be a pointer to one of our brain things, and in here we would have a brain ID, which is the ID, right? I don't know why this is index. So same, right? That's probably too many, right? There's not many of these, so it's probably more like a, you know, that sort of thing. Since mods are cheap, I don't know that power of 2 is such a good idea. I feel like in the future we probably want to make that a prime number and deal with the mod, but, you know, again, minutia we can work out anytime we want, really. So these brain hashes, right, are just things where we can kind of look up and say, okay, let's see if we've got one of these. Wait a second. How does this deal with duplicates? Is this an internally chained hash? This must be an internally chained hash, huh? Ah, yeah, it is. Okay. Well, that makes sense. All right. So anyway, excuse me. So anyway, this is, I suppose in that case too, our entity hash, we might as well just store the entities directly in there, probably. I don't know if that would be bad for cache reasons, because you'd lose a bit more of the hash testing, but I do kind of wonder if we should just have this be entity. Do you know what I'm saying? But that's a story for another time. All right, so we've got our brains. Our brains will get assembled as we sort of, you know, mush these things up. Yeah, I feel like, I guess I don't really know what this value should be. You know, I don't really have any idea. But again, these have a cost to them, and the cost is the clearing, right? So there is an upfront cost for figuring out essentially, there is an upfront cost to having this be arbitrarily sized, because we have to do it every frame. We can do incremental clears and other sorts of stuff like that in the future, but it's definitely the kind of thing that, you know, is probably going to be, you know, could be a pressure point. Who knows? So anyway, we have our brain hash. As entities come in and we see controller IDs for them, we'll add in the brain hash. Obviously, we would have our controller ID of 0 be reserved for no controller, or controller type at least. We have a reserved no controller sort of a thing for that. So that's easy enough. And I think that's about it. It's true that since controller ID can be 0, it's possible that brain type actually doesn't have to have a null. So I'm going to stick it like that for now and say that you actually don't need one here, because if your controller ID just isn't set to anything, then if your controller ID is set to 0, then your controller type, right, doesn't have to have a 0 element. Not that that matters to anyone ever, but it's fine. All right, so during this simulation step, what we want to do here is when we call add entity, right? Which I guess is this situation here. I guess I don't know add entity raw. I don't even think anyone's calling this anymore, are they? I guess I gotta stub that out for the moment. All right, moving on. What is going on? There we go. Moving on, I'm going to have to sort of clean up the damage I did yesterday, like I was saying. So in order to do that, we've got pack entity reference array really isn't a thing anymore. So traversable reference and pack entity reference. Pack entity reference is really just going to be what it was before, I guess. So we just have this. And I believe that the entirety of that code was just saying if the ref had a pointer, right? Basically that. If the reference was a pointer, then the ref ID, or is it index? I forget what it's called here. Yeah. So if we have a pointer set, then we're going to go ahead and set the index equal to the pointer ID, like so. And if we didn't, what we want to do here is say, well, we'll either clear it or leave it the same if the element is not in the hash table, right? So if this sim region doesn't have one of these guys in there, then we would assume that we'd get rid of it. The other thing true that I think is true is during this pack we'd probably want to check if it's deleted, right? So we'd probably say like if deleted or something like this, right? Something like this. So in here, this is kind of temporary for the way we're doing the packing because we don't actually pack it down, we leave it the same, but we still need to do the operation of packing to make sure that the indexes and pointers stay in sync. So we want to do something here where we basically say, okay, if this reference is set to something valid, if it's a deleted entity, if it's an entity that no longer, got marked as being removed from the set of entities that there are in the world, then we'd want to get rid of it, right? We'd want to say like, oh, okay, don't consider this as a dude anymore. Don't think that you're following this guy or whatever because he's gone. Otherwise, we would take its ID and say that's the new thing to store. If we don't have a pointer, then clearing the index is only valid if this thing is in the table. So like it is in hash table. Excuse me. We would want to say something like this. What is it called? Sim region. The reason for this is, well, let's say that I'm referencing somebody, and that somebody walks out of the simulation region. They're just gone. Well, I may want to still remember that, right? So I want to look and go, oh, okay, if my pointer is 0, that means that this guy is no longer visible to me now. But I may want to store the index still. So what I want to do there is say, okay, did I set this value to 0, meaning I'm trying to clear it? Or did the guy just go out of the sim region and is no longer here, and that's why the pointer didn't get loaded this time around, right? And so in that case, I just want to see, well, is it in the hash table? If it's in the hash table, then then someone must have set it to 0 and they're trying to clear out this reference. So let me do that when I pack it. Let me get rid of it, right? That's basically all I'm saying. Okay. So I don't know. Like I said, it's a little janky. I'm not sure about this yet, but that's basically the way it works. The problem here is when we're doing our packing, we don't always have a sim region when we're doing our packing. And the example there is we don't have a sim region during the pack if, like, say, we're doing world creation at that time. You know what I mean? So I don't really know exactly how to approach this. Again, it's something that we're going to have to work on as we go forward. But I would say it's probably something like, okay, you pass a sim region. If you don't pass a sim region, then the pack doesn't do this. So if there's no sim region or it's in the hash table, and I guess I'll take a look in sim region and see exactly how that query ends up happening. Load entity reference here does get hash from ID, this situation. And I think that's really all I have to do. So if I say get hash from ID, sim region, ref index, I don't know why I insisted on putting that as a dot, but it's not a dot. All right. So I come in here and I say, well, is this thing deleted? And that's a query that we're going to have to do like later. We don't really ever delete entities at the moment, but we're going to start, right? So we'd say, if it's deleted, I don't want to store a reference to it. Otherwise, I do want to store the reference to it. If there's no sim region at the moment, so it's world creation time, or I'm trying to get the hash from the ID here, and I see if anything came back. If something does come back, then I want to clear it, because that means it should have been there, so someone must have actually tried to be getting rid of it. But if I don't, then I leave it be, because it's just somebody who walked out of the region and still wants to be there, right? So again, in here, so we kind of have this thing where we're doing the sim region is passed through. Again, in here we've got the same sort of thing: sim region, sim region. And I would say this is probably yeah, all of this stuff just passes it through. And like I said, I'm still not 100% certain about that. It definitely, like, there's definitely some jankiness there, and so it's a question of whether I can think of something smarter to do there. And maybe I can, maybe I can't. I'm not sure. We'll find out. Okay, let's keep going here. So is deleted would be something on the entity. And at the moment, I guess we have this entity flag deleted. So, you know, it's going to be basically a thing that's like, is deleted is just, it takes an entity and returns like e flags and entity flag deleted. Right? And that's really all it is. It looks like I've got an is set here. So I guess this is really just is set entity flag deleted. Right? So moving along, this is dot value. Get hash from ID is not found. Really? Get hash from ID. So if you say get entity by ID and it can't refer to it here, this I feel like this wants to be this, doesn't it? I mean, get entity by ID should be doing the same check, right? And this is essentially this. So I don't really know why those two were different. probably just vestigial remains. We have made a lot of changes here. At some point, we should probably kind of go through. Okay, so sorry, back to what I was doing before. So get hash from ID. I could actually have this just do get entity by ID and have this be a a function that's sort of pre-callable, but I don't know. I'm going to actually just do it like this. All right. So let's see. No operator. Right you are, sir. Pack entity into chunk. So pack entity into chunk doesn't take 3 arguments, and that is actually true. It takes a sim region now. Let's see, sim region hash. So these have to be entity hash now, because we've got multiple hashes. Pack entity into world. So these are just taking 0 because they do not have a sim region. Same here. Is that true? All right. No, so this does have a sim region. Yeah. These are not necessary anymore. So these are they just don't exist anymore. Right? Those are all gone. But we will sort of want to do a thing here where we say, like, okay, allocate another entity ID, right? And we want to sort of make a brain ID for it, right? So we'd say, let's get a brain. Let's add a brain. All that's going to do is give us an ID. It doesn't actually have to create anything. It just gives us a token that we can use. And then we would say, all right, the brain ID, so we'd just come back to entity here. And all of these fields, like controller type, controller slot, these are all going to be set here. Now, how I want to do brain slot, I'm not sure. That's something that we're going to have to play with a little bit. And we'll kind of see why I say that in a second. There's going to be a little bit of touchiness there because we want that to be something that works nice and clean. And there's going to be a little bit of work in us getting that to happen. But, you know, at the moment, let's say that it worked like this, even though this is not how it's actually going to work. So these are basically both the same in all respects except for what slot they go into, right? So they both have the same controller. One of them goes into slot 0, one of them goes to slot 1, right? And the reason I say that I don't really want to do it that way is because I don't want to have to remember a bunch of indices like the head goes in slot 0 and the brain, you know, blah, blah, blah. I want that to be cleaner so we don't have to constantly be remembering a bunch of indices or creating a ton of enumerators or something like this. So we'll want to kind of make that be a little bit more straightforward as we go. But other than that, we're okay. So here's something to add a brain. All this is going to do is exactly the same thing that we do up here, where we do last used storage index, right? We're just going to grab exactly that same thing. So we're just going to say, okay, there's a brain ID. The brain ID just equals whatever the current storage situation is. And then we can like sort of loft this guy up to be here with the other dudes. All right, so in here, I think we called this index, not value. There we go. And then this sort of paired entity thing, so this is now going to be quite a bit different. And the way this is going to work, and I'm kind of really excited. Like I said, I'm pretty excited about this. I have a good feeling about the way this is going, and here's why, right? So what do we want to do, right? How do we want this code to normally work? Well, if we were just writing it without all of this crazy permutations that we want to support, you know, probably we just write some code that's like, for each player, move your guy in the direction you want him to go, and then simulate everything, right? Like, and that's sort of what we had here for our code. Like, we had these controllers, and then we had to put the controller stuff into things, and then we came back here, and we were like picking up, we were like finding what controller you were associated with, and like picking that back up again, right? And crap like this. And so now I think what we can do is we can make like we can make this work exactly that way, but in an organic, like real fashion for that's uniform across everything, and doesn't have that like write and pick back up. It can like do the thing that it wants to do, and then later, you know, and then not have that weird like constantly have to pass things through this ancillary structure, if that makes sense. So yeah. So up at the top here, what we'd be doing is we'd be saying like, hey, I need to loop through all of the brains that are in here, right? And I don't really remember, to be completely honest with you, I don't really remember how the sim region went about organizing this. I guess it's just a max entity count entities sort of a situation, and then we've got the hash table that internally chains into there. So I'm assuming that we would do the same thing here, right? And just have a max brain count, and brains. So in here, before anything else happens, we just have our brain indices. We go over each one of these, which is whatever. So it's the sim region brain count, and we go over the brain index. And then in here we would have, you know, brain star brain equals sim region brains plus brain index. And then here's where we would do the actual logic for whatever those things are. So in our brain, obviously, we'd have whatever the brain type is, and we'd have the brain hero code in here, and we'd have the brain snake code in here, which we haven't written yet. And I guess we also have a brain familiar. We sort of had, although that's, I don't know that we really, that a brain familiar, that's more of a behavior type. And we probably will have yet another thing later down the road, which is like what behavior something is doing at the moment, which will sort of be a separate issue. But yeah. Okay. So we've got brain hero, brain snake, and then we have like an invalid default case here. I don't know if we have, yeah, we do. You know, where things wouldn't work. So we come through here, and in this case, you know, if we've got a controller that's involved, we would sample the controller, and presumably that's actually this code here. We could loft that up into there, and that's actually what I probably would like to do, but we'll hold on that, off on that for a second. And then we've got sort of this code down here, which is the stuff for the hero head and the hero body. And the hero head and body now don't really have to be controlled in this way anymore. We can do these things together, right? But I guess I'll hold off on that for 1 second until we get all our compiler errors cleaned up. Okay, so let's go into sim region here, and I've got this brain stuff. These will probably get pulled out to their own file in a minute, but not yet. And then we've got to just kind of deal with some of these other things here. There we go. Okay, so these paired entity count things, all of this stuff is really, like I said, let's just if zero these things out here for a second. Yeah, because these we don't really want at the moment. So I'm just going to take care of them briefly. this guy has to actually return his result. All right, so I got to clean some stuff up so this will still work, but I just don't want to leave us in like a bogus state because this is going to take us a while. Like this is going to take us, on Monday we're going to have to do some of this as well. All right. So, pack entity reference. Oh, so in this case, I guess we have to check to make sure that the index is not already 0, because obviously that we don't need to do any more processing on. Let's see here. So if it's already 0, we don't have to decide whether to clear it. It's already clear, right? So that's pretty straightforward. Okay. So here we are with, our sort of, our disabled controllers, if you will. And so now what we need to do is figure out how we want to write these cleanly, right? So I want to, again, sort of ping back to the usage code and try to figure out how I would want these to be written given the best possible circumstances, and see if I can reverse engineer back into that, right? Okay. So let's start with this kind of ugly controller code here, and let's grab that. No, this is not really something we're talking about here anymore. Okay. So I'm going to grab all the hero head code, which is all this. And I'm going to bring that up into, let's see here, Brain Hero. It's a lot of code. So inside Brain Hero, I've sort of got this notion of controlled hero. And controlled hero, like, all that really is sort of we were sort of looking over these controlled heroes to find whichever one it was that we were looking at. And obviously, that's something we could probably optimize a little bit better. Because there's really no, like, we could have it so that these line up. It could be that your ID, like your controller ID, is just lines up with the actual physical controller, 0, 1, 2, 3 or whatever. So I feel like we could do this a little bit better, but I guess for the moment that it's fine, doesn't really matter. We can just have it, that there's a brain ID, and that brain ID is what's in the test hero, if that makes sense. So I'm going to do that first and foremost. But then I'm also going to go down here and grab the body stuff. So this stuff doesn't really have to happen. Let's go ahead and get this up here. So here's the body code. I don't know what that bug is. I've been noticing that 4-coder bug happen where stuff just turns bright white, and it later will stop being bright white, but like you got to do something to it. Yeah, there you go. So it gets confused about the syntax highlighting in some kind of way that I'm not super confident how you can reproduce it. But anyway, so now this code just literally needs to do a thing where it's like, all right, I've got this brain, I've got head and body. And both of these are things that may or may not be there, right? So this is what our to-do is. And then as we go through here, we can basically say, like, okay, there is no longer sort of a concept of a entity, quote unquote, that's primal. It's more like, okay, this is, is this the head or is this the body, right? So this is code that only happens on the head branch. All the rest of this code is code that just happens in general. But okay, well, so here's some more head style code in there. Yeah. Where else is entity referenced? I guess I could just compile because entity won't be a thing. There we go. So yeah, so in here, like, this is obviously like our brain ID is going to equal the brain ID of the hero. And let's see. Brains obviously would also presumably always have their ID. I don't know why we're still storing these in the hash. I guess to just make comparison faster, but I'm going to put a to-do in here. Oops. Again, so that's like an optimization, really, of lofting that out, but we don't actually know that that's a win to do that, so it seems kind of stupid to have that be a thing in there. So I would say that's like a premature optimization we would want to actually look at and see if there is a real reason why we are doing it before just doing it. This is not Nike. All right, so handmade.h has those controlled heroes. And so in here, these are going to be brain, like what brain ID I go with. But again, that's like something that we may want to we can probably just do the reverse lookup now, but we'll leave it like that for the time being. So yeah, brain ID is not, wait, what? Value is not a member of brain ID? It's not? When did it cease to become? Oh, it's index. That's no good. All right. So get closest traversable on this entity. So when we do, this was doing the closest one on the head. So I guess this entire thing, I guess this debug spawn code is really just debug code, but we could say that, you know, this is only happens if the head is here. DT, is that something that is not constructed till later? Yeah. Let's see, con hero, consort, entity facing direction. This is again the head. And we need to clean up this code a lot, like a lot. So that's kind of a separate issue. Let's see, where's my head code down here? And I guess GDP. Yeah, again, these are sort of things that are only going to be used in a second here, but we'll see. We have way more. This is the kind of code cleanup that's really hard to do in the Handmade Hero context, because normally I'd spend 4 hours going through all this stuff and making it right, but I literally can't, which is troublesome. But anyway, so this is the head again. And in here, I guess we'd sort of be saying when we, we obviously also only ever do this stuff if we have the head. And we're probably going to want to coalesce these out into chunks that are like, here's the part if we're both a head and body, here's a part if we're only a body, here's a part if we're only a head, kind of a thing. So these we already have all of. Right, and these are talking about that, what the body is going to do. And let's see, we've got our head delta stuff here. If we have a head as well, we figured that out, and that's all good. And off we go. I don't remember how delete entity works. Did we actually implement that? We did. So I would like you to be able to call delete on anything, even if it doesn't exist. So I'm going to leave that like this. And I'm assuming that we actually implemented that. Yeah, we did. So there we go. Okay. And so one thing we could do here too is we could say like these things. So fill these in for the brain. To do Casey, check that they're not deleted when we do. So we'll have to start being more conscientious of that aspect of it. Brain ID is now nothing, and brain ID value, and so this is brain ID, and so now again this all kind of lines up relatively nicely. Because we have everything slot in properly, right? This is going to return that brain ID that it generated, and now the controller is attached to that. And you can kind of see that this is starting to make more sense now too, because before when we did add player, well, we sort of arbitrarily said that the player was the head, and now we don't really have to say that anymore. We just say, we created this notion that there is a group, a loose collection of things that comprises the player. It's this. If you are playing that player, anything that has that tag is under your control, right? And so if we created more things that would sort of glom onto you, that's just how that would work. And they self-assemble, right? It's kind of a bottom-up parsing sort of a situation. Okay, so I'm going to end it there and go to Q&A, but we've got a bunch of, we got one more pass over before we're actually done. So we haven't done this yet. We only did the initial part. But I'll go ahead and go to the Q&A. And that's good. So next week can just basically be brain week, right? Like next week we can figure this out, see if we can make a nice clean set of controller code for the body, pull that out into a separate file. It's like our brains file, make the snake, see if the snake works, and then that will tell us, was this a good idea or is it a bad idea, right? And there you go. Questions and answers. Questions and answers. Questions and answers. No questions, so there are no answers. Well, this is going to be quick. Miblo, I must have missed the bit about the snake. What is that? So a snake is, I was just saying, like, so I was just trying to think of examples of creatures that aggregate potentially multiple entities and don't necessarily have like a fixed idea of what comprises them. So, we have our hero, and the hero is comprised of like the head, and the body. But I was thinking another obvious one to try that's just like a standard kind of game enemy that would be easy case to practice on in terms of seeing whether this architecture works right, is, a snake creature. So, it starts off and it's kind of got a little head, right? And then it's got like a, body parts here and here, and then maybe like a little tail, right? And so these could aggregate up to be a single controller as well, which can think about what it wants to do. So it doesn't just have to like, oh, each one of these guys just knows to follow the person in front of him. We can make something more complicated, like, oh, we can decide to like swing his tail around or do whatever, right? So that's what I was thinking of more. And yeah, someone said it's more of a millipede. And yeah, I mean like, I guess I really mean more like centipede. Like the game Centipede, right? Is much closer. Sort of the creature I had in mind. How long do you hope this will go on for? Do you see yourself doing a different game once this is finished? No, this will be like the only game that I do on a stream, because it'll take a long time. Like, I think I estimated 600 days, and based on where we are, that might be correct or it might not be. I don't know. There might be too much gameplay in here, so it might be that the 600. Because remember, a day is only 1 hour, so it's 600 hours. It's not very many hours to make a game in. It's 14 weeks or something like that. 12 weeks. I don't know. 14? How many weeks is that if you were working 40 hours a week? It's 15 weeks. 15 weeks is just not very long to make a game from scratch. If you're making a game in some completely pre-built engine and all you're doing is like setting some entity flags or something, then, sure. But since we write everything, that's just not very much time. And so, I don't know if that'll be accurate or not, because there might be too much gameplay in this game to get it all in that. But you mentioned you'd spend 4 hours cleaning code. Why not have a Handmade Hero Day once every other month or so and deal with problems like that? Yeah, we could. I just don't know how useful that is, because like you can't choose when that happens, really. I mean, I could try. It's difficult. It's something I would consider as we get further along, potentially. Easy Sigh. About the one entity per grid spot checking, how will you handle leaving a spot just before a monster lands there? Right now it's binary. Do you plan to add a fuzziness as you step off a square onto another one and a monster lands on your spot? We will see how it goes. At the moment, the answer is that, in general, I think that you're probably thinking of it slightly differently, which is to say that the case is more about you hopping onto a monster's slot, because a monster is never going to hop onto your spot unless it's attacking you, and an attack doesn't have to give up the square that it's on, probably, would be my guess. But it's probably more like if a monster was hopping off of this slot and you're about to hop onto it, what happens, right? And I still think it's just when you're here, everything up to this point, you're still on this square, and if you want to cross that center line, this guy's got to be vacating. Right? This guy's got to be vacating his square. And when we do that, I think we'll probably be like earliest option to vacate or something. So monsters will probably vacate immediately if they can. They'll look if this is slow, they'll vacate right here and then jump off, so you'll be able to jump in. But either way, like, this is just how the game design works. So there may be some jankiness with how that goes. Like, that may not be the smoothest feeling thing, but tough, right? The game design requires that you can always be on a particular square. And so that's just how that'll be. Term. Someday I will have to ask you about how to think when representing data in a program. I understand structs, enums, arrays, and such, but what regulates when to use which? Well, I mean, basically, if you've been watching Handmade Hero, you can see the process. It's not, there isn't a rule about when to use which. It's about having gone through enough architecture to know how to experiment and figure out, right? Because you'll notice, like, anytime I'm at something where I don't have a prefab solution in my head, where I'm like, this is how I like to do X, it's like something I've never done before, or it's something where I want to try a new way of doing it than what I used to do, I go through some permutations, right? I don't just sit down and go, here's the answer, because we're not far enough along in programming as an art form or a science to know the answer to how to structure a program. Only very, very simple programs have that, right? Have a known best answer. And usually, you know, what you are writing is not a known thing. So the answer is rarely how do you know which is what to use and here are the rules. It's more like you need to do the things I do on Handmade Hero, right? You need to go through and do architecture many times, different kinds of architecture, and practice seeing how they come out, and then your brain will start to train up on knowing how to do that pathfinding, right? And I don't think there's a substitute for that. People who think that they can draw like UML diagrams or that here's this method of drawing things on index cards, whatever, it's like, no. It's like, that is not work. The thing that works is practice and learning to do it. It's like, you know, no one can tell you how to hit a golf ball or kick a soccer ball or whatever. It's like, they can coach you and they can see you do it and go, oh, you're not thinking about these correctly or whatever. They can give you advice to guide you as you get better at this thing. And watching someone who knows how to do it helps you get better at that thing. But there is no do these rules and out comes the thing. We're not anywhere close to that. Programming is way more like a sport or an art or anything else than it is a series of steps you just wrote apply. Because our understanding of it just isn't at that point yet. And we don't even know if it would ever be, but assuming that someday it would be, we're just not there yet. So I would think of it more as like practice, 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 practice. Do lots of architectures. Try lots of different ways of approaching the same problem. Write down why they succeeded and why they failed. Write down what you think was better about one than the other. How much code did they take? How many bugs did you have, right? Start to internalize all of those things, because that's really the key to getting good enough to stop having problems working through architecture, right? And even if you are very experienced at it and have done it a lot, even at that point, you were still, the reason you are good at it is not because you sit down and immediately know the answer. It's because you know the process that you can use to iterate to get to the answer, right? Or to get to the answer, an answer that is good enough, because there isn't a the answer. There's many ways it could happen, right? So yeah, practice, observe, and if you can find someone to give you advice, like a mentor to give you advice about what you may or may not have done wrong in a program architecture, that's another good thing too, right? Just like, you know, in the sports analogy, having a good coach helps. They can't tell you how to do the thing, but they can give you pointers that help guide your practice of like, yeah, that's right. You know, maybe I'm dropping my shoulder when I'm pitching this, you know, pitch and it goes a little wild. And they told me like, keep the shoulder up and oh yeah, there we go, right? That can help in programming too, right? Long Boolean. So the idea is to have the entity system both be able to support groups of entities that change from one into another, like a monster that mimics other objects, and entities that when separated from the group can take action on their own, like a necromancer resurrecting a ripped off arm. Yeah, I mean, the idea is simply to be able to form without limitation sections that act on their own, right? So, you know, normally we might say each entity can think and it does a thing, but I want to be able to have algorithms that operate across entities because that was becoming a problem and I didn't like where that was going. So the idea here is just to make it it's very simple with our entity system now, I believe, and going forwards we'll get better and better. It'll be very simple to do things like, I want this thing to be more cursed, or more, or to have a curse on it, or do whatever, right? I think, the way we're working on the entity system, it'll be easy to just add stuff that you want. But what it wasn't easy to do with the way that we had it was have multiple things have a piece of code that thinks across several of them at once. And we were butting up against that. And so that's the reason this entity system, I think, wanted this sort of layer, the brain layer that I wanted to try adding, is so that I could write code that thinks across multiple entities and make that be clean and easy. Slightly off topic. On average, how many hours a day do you work on 1935? Well, I'm at work from about 9 to 4. And, there's maybe like an hour of lunch in there. So what is that, like 6 hours or something? Yeah, it's usually like 6 hours of 1935. It's, 2 hours roughly on Handmade Hero, or an hour and a half. And then there's usually like an hour or two of programming on web stuff, or whatever the latest thing is, like having to implement a mailing list system, because whatever, but. Pagan Heart, on the note of UML, how much or often would you say you deal with that at work, if at all? I've literally never seen anyone draw a UML diagram in my entire history in the game industry under any circumstances, ever. Guitar Mini 7, good answer. I understand what you mean. Just do it enough and you'll see what works. Experience. Thanks. Yes. Elysium, have you thought about using Vulkan? I think I've covered that before. Like, I looked at the design of Vulkan and I don't like it, so we will almost certainly not use it on stream. Like, the only reason we use it is for some reason we had to. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. All right. Ooh, as I dropped my water bottle. I'm glad these things are sealed well. Didn't spill at all. Thank you very much for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along with the source code at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with the source code so that you can sort of do experiments with it and so on. We also have a forum site you can go to if you would like to ask questions. We have a Patreon page you can use to support the video series. If you like what you see and want it to show your appreciation, it's always much appreciated on our end, certainly. We also have a schedule bot, which tweets the schedule for the live streams. So if you want to know when they're going to be, you can take a look at that, or follow it on Twitter, and it will tell you. And then we also have an episode guide maintained by the king of annotation, Miblo himself. And that got even cooler recently. So there is now like a thing. I don't really know how to get to it, but I'll show you. Andrew. Well, his name is Andrew Johnson, but he's like Andrew JDR. Oh, here it is. He's like Andrew JDR on like usually on like his handle, like on chats and stuff like that. But he made this new thing. So if you are someone who has pre-ordered the game, you can use your GitHub access, like the Sendowl download page. When you pre-order the game, you get like a little Sendowl download. You can download source code and stuff. There's a thing on there that's like GitHub access. And if you haven't done that yet, you can use that. You can go grab that key and you can put it in and authorize. It's got instructions there. You can authorize yourself for GitHub access. On the GitHub, Andrew JDR created this repository that's pretty cool. You should check it out if you try to follow along with the series at home. Because it's basically got this HTML directory, which is just every file as it currently is in the game. But instead of the file being a CPP or an H file, it's actually just an HTML file of the source code. But in line with the source code, I actually don't know. How do you, wait, oh, sorry, never mind. It's the MD. For some reason, even though there's an HTML directory, GitHub can't use it. So you can download it and do that, but GitHub can't display it. If you go to the MD directory, it can display directly. So if you click on one of those, it will show you the source code. And every line of the source code has what episodes I like worked on that that area of the code, right? So you can like jump to like, oh, when was this thing talked about? Like, oh, episode 131, and you just click on it, and you get to a thing where it's got the when I worked on that, right? So that can be kind of handy if you're trying to like go back through things. So that's a new thing. Again, that was done by Andrew Johnson, which is pretty great. So I would highly recommend checking that out if you are interested in it. That's about it. I will catch you guys back here next week. Check the schedule bot for the schedule. I'll post it this weekend. Take it easy, everyone.